Okay, I guess we're getting started. So thank you for coming. Please have a seat. I'll give it 10 seconds. Okay, that wasn't 10 seconds, but to hell with it. Let's get started. Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming to the talk. I hope you're having a good conference. My name is Tomo, and this is going to be the least technical conference of the entire conference, because today we're going to be talking about history. So, just to get a beat, I can't see anyone, but I'm going to ask anyway. Let's start with a quick pop quiz. Can anyone tell me what this is? Feel free to yell out. Violin, yes, very much a violin. More specifically, though, this is a Stradivarius violin, which you've probably heard of. These were made in largely the 17th century or so and are considered to be possibly the best violins money can buy. Second example, can anyone tell me what this is? Well, it's a knife, yes, but the point is, what's special about the knife? Damascus steel, thank you. I can't see anything, so I don't know who said it, but yes, it is indeed a knife made from Damascus steel, dating back to the 13th century. Damascus steel was considered to be some of the finest steel out there, and weapons made of Damascus steel were very, very highly sought after for, a good few hundred years. Last example, a little bit more esoteric. Can anyone recognize what this depicts? Greek or thing. Someone said Greek fire as well. Yes, thank you. This is Greek fire. This is from the 7th century. This is the equivalent of modern-day napalm. It was used by the Byzantine Empire to repel invasions. And that is the extent of actual history that we're going to be covering. But more importantly, can anyone tell me what these three things have in common? We don't know how to make these anymore. This is knowledge that is lost to humanity. Now, I'm not going to claim that we don't have better techniques nowadays. So we have violins that are perfectly modern, that are made these days, that arguably sound even better or every bit as good as the Stradivarius did. We have, anyone can go in, buy a chef's knife that would put this 13th century dagger to shame. And we, unfortunately, have napalm, which is a hell of a lot more destructive than anything the Byzantines had. But what's more important is we don't know how to make any of these things anymore. The woodworking technique Stradivarius used, gone. The exact process by which Damascus steel was made, gone. There are modern probable equivalents, but we don't actually know how these were made several hundred years ago. Same with Greek fire. So we have napalm, it's amazing-ish, but the exact chemical composition, the exact method used to make Greek fire, and Greek fire, by the way, did exist, we know that for a fact, is lost to history. So all of this knowledge is simply lost to humanity. We don't know how to make these things anymore. And it gets worse, because whereas the three examples I gave you are physical artifacts, or techniques, or science, if you will, the vast sum of human knowledge is not actually physical, right? The majority of what we as humanity know is ephemeral, right? It's knowledge, it's language, it's art, it's music, it's literature. We know, for instance, that people came to this continent at some point in history. We call them the Proto-Indo-European speakers, right? The people that spoke that very ancient language. But we don't really know what it sounded like. We don't really know what they were, how they were thinking. We don't know much of anything about how they lived their lives beyond the practical reality of the artifacts that we've managed to find and analyze and figure out since. So how people lived, how people thought, how people loved, what they did for fun, all of that is knowledge that's lost to human history. And unfortunately, that is true of the vast majority of the history of human knowledge. We simply don't know and never will a lot of things about the early days of humanity. So Whereas the physical artifacts remain with us, and modern science can usually figure out how things were made and what they were used for, etc., the more ephemeral aspects of humanity are ones that we have lost. And this brings us to today's subject, which is computing. We live in very interesting times. And I'm not just referring to, the everyday reality of politics and war and what have you. I'm talking about history. I'm talking about things that are pivotal to humanity. We are living in what many people smarter than I am have called the third or fourth industrial revolution, the digital age, whatever you want to call it. But computing, there is one thing everyone agrees on. Computing is pivotal to human history. And we don't even know what that means just yet. And we probably never will in our lifetime because, that's the nature of history. But we are living in this very, very interesting time when our industry, which is very young, by the way, the whole history of computing dates back, depending on how you count it, 70, 80, maybe 200 years if you consider Babbage a computing genius. But computers as we know them exist since about the 1940s, 1950s. Personal computers, i.e. this thing, the sort of computer we all actually use on a day-to-day basis, these things started showing up in the mid-1970s, right? So the whole industry as we know it is 50 to 80 years old. And already we've lost a lot of the early days of history. A lot of it is murky, a lot of it is misunderstood, a lot of it is unknown. Let me give you some examples. Why do we call bugs bugs, right? Seems a simple enough question. I'm sure a few of you have asked yourselves that. I'm sure the vast majority of you never bothered thinking about it, right? But where does this term come from? Now, there is an amazing story around that some of you may have heard, but it's a fun story. It always bears repeating, so let's do that. On the 9th of September 1945, at the Harvard University, a computer was being built for the Navy. It's called the Harvard Mark II, very famous early computer. On that team, and leading the software team, was one Rear Admiral, then Lieutenant Grace Hopper. Right? Yes, that Grace Hopper, the one you may have heard of. The computer was having issues, right? On one day, the computer was just starting to act up. It didn't calculate things correctly. It didn't, execute things correctly. And Grace Hopper and her team came in, started performing a complete system diagnostic. Now, I will point out that when I say the Mark II computer, it's a computer only in the strictest kind of academic sense of the word. That thing was humongous. It took a whole building. It weighed 23 tons. It had thousands upon thousands of electromechanical relays as part of its digital Boolean algebra operation. It's a mammoth, right? Grace Hopper and her team started going over the computer bit by bit, and they ended up finding a moth that was physically stuck in one of the relays. Right? Literally jamming the relay, causing all of the malfunctions. Computers back then, being the big machines they had a logbook in which everything that was done diagnostically or in terms of maintenance to the computer was logged so that operators can know what happened on the day before. So Grace Hopper and her team found the moth. They logged the malfunction in a logbook, and they actually taped the moth, and some of you probably have seen this picture. They actually physically taped the moth in the logbook and recorded it with the heading, "First actual case of bug being found," thereby coining the term software bug, or rather the term computer bug as we know it today. Fascinating story, a lot of fun. Except it's not bullshit, but it's inaccurate to say the very, very least. So to start with, it wasn't 1945, it was 1947. 1945 is an attribution mistake made by a university that was the first to receive this physical logbook and archive it. Now, whether that matters or not, we'll get back to. You may or may not have known that, but would it surprise you to know that beyond physically being in the building on that day, Grace Hopper had nothing to do with the story at all. She was not part of the team making the diagnosis. She didn't record it in the logbook. She wasn't involved in taping them off. And she basically wasn't part of the story at all. And yet, somehow, whenever the story is told, it is attributed to Grace Hopper for reasons. Also, what's attributed to Grace Hopper as part of the story is coining the term computer bug. Except that we know for a fact that's not the case. Not just because it wasn't Grace Hopper, but because the term bug, in the way that we mean it, referring to an engineering malfunction inside some kind of machine, we don't really know where it comes from, but we do know that the earliest recorded use of it is actually attributed to Thomas Edison. Yes, that Thomas Edison, in a letter written in 1878. Right? So the term bug, as it was used here, was at least 60 years older than this story. Right? So where does it come from? Where does the engineering term bug come from? We don't know, which is kind of exactly my point. Right? It's apocryphal, there's stories, there's a lot of stuff to learn around it, but we, for a fact, don't know. Second example, what was the first digital computer called? Can anyone say? ENIAC, right? Everyone knows the first digital computer was the ENIAC, standing for Electronic Numerical Integrator and Calculator. Except it wasn't. It literally wasn't, and we know that for a fact, because across the Atlantic, in Europe, working for a little-known German dictator of the time, a certain Dr. Konrad Zuse, a self-trained engineer, was building what he termed thinking machines. And he was toiling in basically obscurity because at that point, as part of Nazi Germany, he was working in intellectual isolation from the rest of the world for pretty obvious reasons. But in 1941, Konrad Zuse had completed a computer called the Z3, which is the first known programmable computer. Electromechanical, but still, first known programmable digital computer. That's in 1941. That's 4 years before the ENIAC came online. And by the way, as it happens, Z3, which seems like a reasonable name given that the inventor is Zuse, wasn't even called Z3. It had a different name, and it was renamed retroactively after the war to disassociate the invention with some other pretty famous German invention of the 1940s. Not even that. Even back across the other side of the war, right, among the Allied nations, even then, the ENIAC wasn't the first computer, because in 1943 through 1945 in Bletchley Park, a place you will have heard of, because nowadays kind of everyone knows about Alan Turing and the Enigma machine and the work that was done in Bletchley Park. When the ENIAC came online, this little thing called the Colossus was already on its second iteration with 10 machines actually deployed in breaking German messages encrypted with the Lorenz cipher. And that's when the ENIAC came online, right? Those were already in operation. So we didn't know that until the 1970s. Because of the secrecy at Bletchley Park, until the British government kind of started unveiling documentation and acknowledging the work that was done at Bletchley Park, up until the 1970s, no one in the general public knew that that place had any ramifications on the war, knew that it had anything to do with computing, and yet there were 10 physical computers working during World War II, right? So even though everyone knows ENIAC was the first computer, that's just not true, right? The fact of the matter is that as young as this industry is, we are in an interesting situation and an interesting position. On the one hand, this is all very young. A lot of these people are still alive. We can talk to them, we can learn from them. A lot of them, unfortunately, are not, but that is the nature of human existence. But, even more importantly, the history of computing is already starting to be lost. And the artifacts that would be useful to understanding that history are getting also basically being lost to the pages of history. So whether or not that matters is a valid question, right? Whether the fact that it was 1947 versus 1945 matters is a good question. Whether the fact that Grace Hopper was pivotal in the history of computing, whether that fact is worth recording in the annals of human history is a valid question. It's deserving of a thoughtful answer. Now, I don't really have that answer, but I can point to virtually any field of human endeavor and human engineering and human ingenuity. And we collectively as humanity have already made the determination that it matters. Whether or not you're interested in the sciences or in chemistry or in literature, which I hope you are, but whether or not you are interested in any of these, you know these people by name. You don't know what they looked like, maybe, but here on the left you have Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. Everyone in this room knows that name. In the middle, you have Marie Curie, the discoverer of radioactivity. Everyone in this room will have heard that name sooner or later. On the right, George Orwell, the writer of 1984. Whether or not you're interested in literature, you will have heard that name. You will have heard of that book, right? So collectively as humanity, we've already made the determination that achievements in virtually every field are worth noting. So if all of us here that may or may not have any interest at all in these fields have heard of these people, is it not inconceivable to think that in 50 or 100 or 150 years, everyone in this room at that time will have heard, say, of these people? On the left, Margaret Hamilton, the leader of the Apollo program software division, right? She was responsible for the software that landed people on the moon. In the middle, Ed Roberts, he designed the first commercially available personal computer, at least on the Western Hemisphere, the MITS Altair. You may or may not have heard of it, but it's conceivable to think that it matters, that people will care in 50 or 100 years. And of course, on the right, we have Linus Torvalds, which, whatever you think of the guy, there is no denying that the progenitor of Linux and Git is a meaningful figure in the history of computing, and that computing is a meaningful field in human endeavors, in human history, right? So I don't have the answers. I don't know that these people are going to be remembered. What I do know is that it's conceivable that they will be, and therefore the history of computing should matter at least as much as the history of any other field of human interest. Now, although we don't know what's going to matter, we can't look back hundreds of years or even a few decades and figure out what's important and what isn't. That's a job for future historians. What we can do is figure out what we collectively, again, there is no call to action for anyone here, but we collectively as humanity, as the computer industry, can make some efforts to make future historians' lives easier. And it all revolves around three very fundamental questions. What artifacts are future historians going to be interested in? What context is going to be helpful to future historians to understand these artifacts, the context in which they were created, the context in which they were used? And what can we do to preserve these artifacts for future generations to actually be able to make those determinations? And those three questions, for the software industry, for the computing industry as a whole, I think actually have very straightforward answers. First, we have three types of artifacts in computing that future historians would care about. We have the software, the bits and bytes, right? We're talking about your code, we're talking about configuration files, binaries, third-party dependencies, Docker images, what have you, right? And if you want an example of that, I think it was fairly recently that the source code for the first version of Microsoft Basic was discovered somewhere and unleashed on the world. And there was a whole flurry of interest around the internet. That's just one example, right? A very trivial example maybe, but an example. So the software in and of itself is a form of artifact that future historians may be interested in. Then there's the hardware, right? Any software system, regardless of where you are on the stack and regardless of what it is that the system does, ends up running on a CPU somewhere. So the hardware in and of itself is also an artifact of interest to future historians. And then, by far, the biggest category is documentation. So here we're talking about manuals, we're talking about README files, we're talking about configuration examples, we're talking about much more visceral things that you interact with on a daily basis, such as Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is a treasure trove for a hypothetical future historian trying to determine how humanity built its early computing substrate, right? So these are the three categories of artifacts that we care about in the context of computing and that future historians are likely to be interested in, again, in that context. So this tells us what the artifacts are. The documentation, assuming it's available, provides the context, because documentation typically tells you the why, the how, anything to do with a software system. What remains is preservation, which is a big topic. Again, we are living in very interesting times, and it's kind of easy to ignore. Early knowledge preservation in humanitarian terms, right? How do we preserve knowledge? We have institutions to do that. Historically speaking, we're talking about things like monasteries and libraries and places where physical manuscripts and books and scrolls and stone tablets and everything you can imagine that stores knowledge was present, right? This is an artist rendition of the Library of Alexandria, perhaps the most famous library in all of human history, that burned down around the 4th century AD, as I recall. You will notice that the artifacts of knowledge from any period of human history are stored on physical media, right? We, again, have stone tablets, we have leather scrolls. With the invention of the printing press in the 17th century, mass literacy became a thing. The wealth of human knowledge is spread rapidly, but we're still talking about physical artifacts. We're still talking about paper. We're talking about books, right? These artifacts have a number of issues associated with them. First of all, they're voluminous, by which I mean they're big. Okay, having a large collection of books requires a large space in which to store those books. And even more importantly, those artifacts are volatile. So when the Library of Alexandria burned down, everything that was in it burned down with it, and that human knowledge that was recorded on those manuscripts and on those scrolls that were stored there is lost to history, right? And that's just the fact that the reality of it for basically the duration of human existence. Until recently, because nowadays we are living in what, again, it's a very kind of weird term to use seriously, but we're living in the digital age or the information age. Now, other people have said it, not me, fortunately, but what's critical to understand is that whereas the storage and preservation and replication and dissemination of human knowledge was a completely physical endeavor up until very, very few years ago, up until a few decades ago. Nowadays, with the advent of digital storage, digital communications, digital mediums, basically, our library is a collection of bits and bytes, right? Storing human knowledge is dirt cheap compared to what it used to be. We don't need a huge building with basements, with stacks and stacks and stacks of books and scrolls and everything you can imagine. All we need is a CD or a hard drive somewhere, and we can store insane amounts of knowledge and text and imagery and videos and everything. That just didn't exist at any other point in human history. This is all brand new. Our parents didn't have this. We do. We take it for granted. Nowadays, we can just Google everything. It's all digital. We get the knowledge down to our computers. We don't have to move anywhere. We don't have to print it out. We don't have to go to the library, right? That is a fascinating change in how things are done. And it also has one more critical ramification, which is that the cost of replicating and sharing human knowledge is next to nothing. Replicating a scroll is expensive. You need a physical scroll. You need a scribe who is trained in writing, right? In the 16th century, that would have been an expensive endeavor. Nowadays, you copy a file. You send a post request somewhere, right? It's trivial. You don't even think about it. But the cost of replication and storage for human knowledge nowadays is next to nothing, especially compared to virtually any other time in human history. Which brings us to institutions like the Internet Archive, whereas the preservation of knowledge was a very specialized and expensive and difficult thing to do at any point in human history. Nowadays, doing it well and at scale is still kind of expensive and difficult and specialized, but not even in the same ballpark numbers as what starting the simplest of libraries is going to be. So you have institutions such as the Internet Archive, which see themselves as modern-day types of libraries. They store and archive and disseminate human knowledge, making it available to basically anyone for any reason at all, because it's just bits. Right? This is a fascinating time to be alive, and it's very easy to ignore it. So if we were to build a digital archive of human knowledge, and specifically a digital archive of human knowledge about computing, what would that entail? Well, as with any archive, the first step to having an archive of knowledge is to acquire that knowledge, acquisition. Now, the history of computing is not a very long history, 80 years or so, and we still have access to a lot of this information. And this comes in one of three big forms, three chief ways in which we get at that knowledge. First of all, companies that are sufficiently large and long-lived and forward-thinking tend to have archival departments. So that would be true of your modern-day tech giants like Microsoft or IBM or Apple or companies of that ilk. Those that are sufficiently forward-thinking start their archival department for very practical reasons that have nothing to do with the philosophy of sharing and preserving human knowledge. It's more for stuff like litigation and patent research and whatnot, right? But some of these companies do open up their archives to external researchers for various reasons. And those tend to have the most precise, if you will, and true to form knowledge that you might want about a particular company. And because those companies are very often pivotal in the history of computing, such as Microsoft and IBM and whatnot, that knowledge is priceless, and it's available, or at least conceptually available. Not all companies are sufficiently big, sufficiently successful, sufficiently long-lived, or sufficiently forward-thinking to do that, which means that another source of this type of knowledge has to actually do with ex-employees of these companies. So one example I could give you is that Colossus computer that we've mentioned earlier that was virtually unknown until the 1970s. Now, when the war ended, all but two of these computers were dismantled. Those two computers were sent to the British GCHQ, which is basically their security apparatus that deals with code breaking and what have you. and were in use until the early 60s, at which point they too were dismantled, and everyone involved in that project, because of the secrecy around it, was ordered to destroy everything to do with those machines. Destroy the documentation, destroy the plans, destroy everything. And for the most part, they did, right? Because they are conscientious people. Some didn't. And although the legality of it is dubious for people that have worked for companies or organizations that have shut down and have kept the artifacts, have kept the machines, have kept the documentation, the plans, the paperwork, while it is of dubious legality and might have been an issue back then, it is a great boon to us because a lot of these people still have that stuff, and a sufficiently motivated researcher can find these people, and that is where we get a lot of the information we have about the early days of computing. So specifically, the Colossus had been replicated. There's a modern-day replica, working replica of the Colossus in Bletchley Park that would not have been possible had not a bunch of people that were involved in that project to begin with just held on to the material. Right, so that's another category or source of this type of knowledge and artifacts. The third is my personal favorite, which is nerds and their collections. For anything human, you're going to find enthusiasts. Some people collect stamps, some people collect baseball cards, some people collect tech manuals. There's an enthusiast for everything, including computers. And these enthusiasts, especially with the advent of the internet, find each other and they share information. And that is how a lot of things that we didn't know suddenly come to light. So one example of this is with the fall of the Soviet Union, it eventually emerged that the Soviet Union, which is something that a lot of you here in this room will have encountered, the Soviet Union had basically a completely parallel computing industry to that of the West, to that of the west parts of Europe and North America. And a lot of the enthusiasts that came out of the ex-Soviet Union emerged with that knowledge and started sharing it, which is how we now know that, for instance, Poland had a computer industry in the 1970s and 80s. And computers were produced locally, both personal computers and larger computers for research and business use and what have you. And had we not had access to these nerds and their collections, we simply would not know. And that is another bit of history that could have been lost. Once we've acquired the artifacts, the computers, the software, the manuals, and everything else, the next step is to actually ingest them into an archive, okay? Ingestion in the sense that we as software engineers are familiar with. This is a three-step process. You get the thing, you attach metadata to the thing. So provenance is the history of an artifact, the ownership, where it came from, who owned it, what was done to it, where it was manufactured, all of the metadata around a particular artifact. Ideally, you can collect and attach to that artifact. And in the modern sense of archival, there's also digitization, because a lot of these things are physical, and if we are to archive them as part of a digital archive, we need to find ways of actually scanning, reading it in, doing whatever it takes to get those to a digital medium. And that is actually a fascinating thing in and of itself because, for instance, a lot of the early documentation around both computers, hardware and software, was in paper form, right? You had logbooks, you had tech publications, you had manuals. All of these things that predate the internet were in paper form. So getting all of these into a digital domain, scanning all of these manuals is actually a pretty big, laborious, time-consuming operation that requires equipment and requires specialized expertise, and it requires time. What's even more important, though, is that we have to do it now. And by now, I mean in this general time frame, in the last couple of decades and over the next couple of decades, because all of these artifacts are degrading. Paper degrades. Magnetic media degrades even worse, right? The software that was driving these old computers, often on magnetic tape media or floppy disks or even spinning hard drives, all of that stuff is breaking down already, right? So if we want to preserve that data, although we, again, being where we are in the space-time continuum, we don't know what's going to be important in 10 or 50 or 100 years, we are in a position where we are the only people that actually can preserve this data. Another example of that is with physical media like floppy disks. So apparently, although your typical 3.5-inch floppy disk that a lot of us had used back in the day is the same floppy disk regardless of what you use it for, it turns out that there's a lot of different ways of encoding data onto a floppy disk. A floppy disk that was formatted on an Amiga, for instance, would not be readable on a PC, and neither of them could read a Macintosh 400K floppy disk of the time without some specialized hardware, right? So enthusiasts and archivists have found ways of preserving not the data, not the files that are on this media, but the actual transitions in magnetic flux that the actual floppy drive hardware would use to read stuff and write stuff to that media. Okay, you can think of it as the raw thing without knowing anything about how the disk is formatted or what's on it or whatever. Figuring out whether it's useful or not, that's the job of future historians. Preserving the stuff, the raw data, so that future historians have something to dig into, that's on us. Because, again, the people that have the knowledge are slowly dying because humans only live so long. And the physical media is dying because chemistry and nature, right? So we have a limited span of time to actually preserve this stuff for future generations. And there's a lot of work that's being done to that effect. With respect to hardware, there is also another step, right? With software and manuals and whatnot, once you've archived it, it's archived. As long as you don't use the bits, it's there forever. With hardware, though, there is the angle of restoration. If we want to have these machines in working order so we can do research on them or use them or experience them, we actually need to mechanically do something to get those machines in working order. And these machines are old, right? Old machines are old. Old electronics die off, capacitors blow up, resistors blow up, things fail all the time. So even for a relatively, in historical terms, modern machine like this Amiga here, there's a lot of different things that can fail in it. First of all, we require people with electronic skills to actually fix the thing, replace the dead components. But there's also other types of knowledge that enters into it. So for instance, a lot of you will have probably noticed that old computers tend to be yellow. I'm not talking about the beige colors that computers in the 80s and 90s tended to be designed with. I'm talking about actual yellow, right? An old computer that you dig out of your parents' attic is very likely to be significantly more yellow than you remember it should be, because it is. Because the plastic these things are made of reacted to ultraviolet light and actually yellowed over time. So enthusiasts with some knowledge of chemistry have actually evolved ways of restoring these computers to their original state without damaging them and without modifying anything about what the machine actually is, because the whole point is preservation. And there is a lot of electrical engineering and software engineering involved. So nowadays, you have add-on hardware that makes these old machines usable with modern hardware, modern accessories. Again, going back to the example of the floppy disks, right? Floppy disks are something that maybe is still being made by some niche companies, but no one's going to be making floppy disks in 10 or 20 years, and the old media is going to die off. So if you want to have that Amiga computer actually runs something for any reason at all, you're going to have to feed it the software somehow, and you can no longer use the primary means of doing that the computer was designed for. Which is why many, many, many modern pieces of tech are being designed to actually allow that. One canonical example is something called the GoTech, which is a floppy drive emulator. You plug it in to the floppy drive interface in old machines, and on the other side, it takes a USB stick. Right? You save disk images to the USB stick in digital form. It emulates the floppy drive, and as far as the machine is concerned, it's using the same hardware it always has. Another example is the display. Right? Old computers used to use these big-ass CRTs that are no longer being manufactured because it's totally outdated tech that no one cares about. So you need to find, if you actually want to see what the computer is showing, you need to find a way to actually convert the signal that these computers emit to something a modern TV can take. So you have devices like the RetroTink, which takes in VGA and RGB and CGA colors and composite and all of these old standards and SCART and what have you, upscale them and output HDMI. These are not trivial devices. There's a lot of engineering that goes into it. And all of that is necessary just to be able to take this old computer and plug it in and see the Commodore 64 BASIC or whatever come up. Otherwise, we simply couldn't do anything with these machines. So the whole act of restoring and making these machines operable is an integration of basically every engineering discipline that you'd care to mention. Everything from software engineering, hardware engineering, electrical engineering, chemistry, 3D printing, everything goes into it. It's a hodgepodge of interesting and fascinating techniques and ideas. Once you've acquired, archived, and restored things, now comes the best part, displaying the things. Now, it is easy to think of these old computers as curiosities or think of them fondly in nostalgia. But, and here's a quick poll for you. Please raise your hand if you've ever heard of computer museums. Okay, so that's a good half of the audience. Please keep your hands up for just 2 more seconds. Follow-up question. Please keep your hand up in the air if you've ever visited a computing museum. Yeah, I think there's I don't see very well right now, but I think there's 5 hands in the air. Isn't it amazing that we consider everything to be museum-worthy? We have art museums, we have geology museums, science museums, natural history museums. Hell, we have Madame Tussauds. We have a museum of wax dolls that look like people, right? And all of us are fine with it. All of us consider it to be trivial. But so very few of us consider computers and computer software and computer games to be worthy of being in a museum and being seen and interacted with by people. Well, as it happens, you may or may not have known, but there's at least 2 computer museums in Poland. One in Wrocław, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering the way these are pronounced, and one in, I think, Warsaw. Those are just the 2 that I've found out on coming here. Now, I'm hoping to visit at least one of these on this trip, but for those of you who live here, I encourage you to, because these are legitimate museums. And speaking from experience, although a lot of you here will have remembered what these things used to be like. A lot of us here are old enough to have used computers in the 80s and have used floppy disks and have used CRTs. Speaking from experience, your children don't. Your children have never had that experience. They are going to be shocked to find that the computers you grew up with do not connect to the internet, for instance. They're going to be even more shocked to find that a lot of them don't connect to anything at all, that they're totally standalone. They're going to be shocked to find that the display devices you used to use were not these thin things or this 7-inch touchscreen with vivid colors and brightness that you have on your phone, but these gargantuan CRTs with low resolution and low fidelity that actually emit a high-pitched whine while they're operating. They have not experienced any of that stuff. The only way they are going to is in a museum. right? By definition. So all of this is to say that we are living in a fascinating time where, on the one hand, everything is too new for us to kind of take seriously as part of history, but also old enough to be degrading and in need of preservation. And if you're interested in any of this, then there's any number of ways to get involved or not get involved, or just enjoy the fruits of the labor of enthusiasts. So one thing you could do, and I encourage you to, is visit museums like this. I can tell you that my personal story includes collecting old computers since the late 90s. I've been doing that for many, many years, repairing them. On basically every trip outside of the country, I try to find something to add to my collection. And all of this stuff is ideally intended to be used as the seed collection for a museum in my home country of Israel. That is my retirement plan. And I'm perfectly content making that, making that known, because it is ideally how I want to spend my later years in life, running, maintaining, restoring, researching, and sharing the history of computing with people that have not lived through it. And if any of that stuff is of any interest to you, then I will leave you with these links, which obviously you can use as is, but also I will share the slide deck. There's these two museums. There are Facebook groups that are dedicated specifically in Poland to trading in these devices and these machines, and also restoring them and figuring out new techniques to get them to run. There are YouTube channels that are absolutely amazing treasure troves of information, also for future historians, where people take these devices, figure them out, repair them as needed. A lot of it is esoteric knowledge that maybe no one alive today knows, so they have to employ things like reverse engineering and redesigning hardware and software and building stuff up just to get these machines to do anything useful again. We are lucky to be living in this very transformational time in human history, and it's very, very easy to ignore just how pivotal the last few decades have been. Some of us have grown up in pre-internet times. Some of us remember pre-internet times. Our children will not. And I think our children are going to find it fascinating the way we used to live our lives and the way we used to do computing back in the day before the internet and before all of this wonderful modern tech. And no one but us is going to be there to tell those stories. And no one but us is going to be there to take these artifacts and make them available to future generations for research and for entertainment and for nostalgia's sake and for any reason at all. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I hope you have a wonderful conference, and thank you very much for your attention and time. Cheers. Now, are there any questions? Yes, there are. That is very surprising. Okay, let's go through it as long as we have the time. Will it not be a problem for future historians of too much information to do anything useful with? The short answer is no. There's no such thing as too much information. There is, however, such a thing as that one missing piece. Sifting through the data, figuring out what's important, how things interconnect, what matters, by definition is not something we can do. We can only provide the raw data. Will there ever be too much of it? I kind of doubt it, because also the techniques that historians employ will evolve over time, and they're already evolving. Add into that the obvious buzzwords like AI, suddenly things become potentially very, very different. So no, I don't think it's going to be a problem ever. Next question. If the cost of preserving knowledge is close to nothing, why was I asked to donate to Wikipedia? I did as I thought it was a good idea. Was it? I don't have a good answer to the second part of that question, because Wikipedia has its own issues. But the cost is next to nothing. It's not nothing. The fact that institutions like Wikipedia can hold on to and preserve as much knowledge as they do based on public donations, which don't actually amount to that much money, is amazing, right? The funds that Wikipedia is getting from donations is probably a drop in the ocean of what an institution like the Smithsonian requires for its year-on-year operating costs, for hiring staff, for hiring, for having the space for all these physical artifacts. So is it worth it? With Wikipedia specifically, I don't have a good answer. In the general sense, very much so. Okay, one last question, and then I think we're out of time. Just recommending the Pinball Museum and Arcade Museum. They're both great here in Krakow. Yeah, I've been to both. They are fun. They are not quite as extensive or, let's call it, serious-minded as the sort of museums I was talking about here, but they are valuable and they are very cool. Do you think that physical books will eventually disappear? If yes, will they be very valuable in the future? Will they, I assume, be very valuable in the future? They will eventually disappear because they'll degrade, right? And all we'll have left is a few books that are kept in specialized enclosures that are humidity sensitive and whatnot, like we do today with ancient manuscripts, right? So those are going to be, again, physical museum-grade artifacts that there are very few of them and can never be replicated. So yes, absolutely, I think books will eventually go away, whether we like it or not. Okay, we are very much out of time. Thank you very much. If you want to talk about any of this, please find me now, later, tomorrow, and have a great day and a great conference. Thank you.